All right, welcome back to Conscious Construction, the Conscious Enneagram podcast. I am Abby Robbins.
And I'm Kimberly Culbertson.
And today we are talking about type 6.
What? Type 6.
Yeah, so we're full on in the head center, and we have hit the anchor type of the head center. Hit us with those three demarcations.
Sure.
Kim.
So the 6 is in the head center. The stance is the compliant stance. And then the conflict resolution is emotional realness.
Head, compliant, emotional realness. What I literally said right before we started recording was that like 6s are just full of contradictions.
Yeah, I think you maybe wouldn't quite go like a compliant person is emotional realness.
Yeah.
It's the hardest one to go like, oh, they maybe don't quite match, which is part of why the 6 has like a real back and forth energy.
Yeah.
And it's often the only type where we talk about how there's really two types of 6s, depending on who the teacher is. They talk about phobic and counterphobic. And then some teachers say that's not a thing. And then some teachers say, actually, there's two types of every type, but it's the most pronounced in the 6. So there's a lot to talk about with the 6.
Yeah, my approach on that, and we talked a little bit both when we talked about the 9 and the 3, is that the anchor types, because as Peter O'Hanrahan says, the dominant center is not available for personal use. There are two centers that are available for personal use, and depending on which one they lean into more, there may be two types. Or two different vibes of the same type for 6, 9, and 3. That's how I tend to approach it.
Yeah.
It is important to remember when we're talking about this sort of thing that like every type has a myriad of different expressions.
It's true. It's definitely true.
What I think is so interesting about 6s is that all of those myriad of different expressions could be in the same person. Yeah,
that's true.
When we think about the head, compliant, and emotional realness, there is a lot of competing energy. So let's talk about, let's break it down and let's talk about the head center with our resident head center expert, Kim.
Coming around to the 7. And I definitely have a 6 wing, so I'm very familiar with the 6. Actually wondered for a little while if I was a 6, because there are certain 6-y things that I definitely excel at.
I like that. Excel at. Oh, there goes my phone. Well. Fun.
So the 6 is in the head center, and the head center, their prominent emotional struggle is with anxiety or fear. And I think the 6 is kind of the poster child for that. That the 6 is the one that you can see it the most on the surface. They kind of really live into that sense of anxiety and also into, the head center overthinking. So each of the head center types are overthinkers, but the 6 is the most likely to do it out loud. And so when you're in relationship with the 6, will experience that overthinking as well. And so,
That's really interesting, because I think when we look at the other anchor types, just like in comparison, right, we see the 9s as the anchor of the head types, and people are like, oh, it's so weird to think of 9s as dealing with anger. And we look at 3s as the anchor of the heart types, and it's like, oh, it's so weird that 3s are like struggling with shame. But like where
and then you get to the 6 and it's like,
it's like, oh yeah, that's of course, like maybe more than either 7 or 5. It's like very, very clear, but that's not necessarily the case for the other two anchor types. So I find that very interesting. That like it has that much like that difference to it.
And I don't think the 6 does more overthinking than the 7 or the 5. I think the 6 is just doing it more out loud, and because they're that compliant type, they're doing it, they want that sounding board, and so you just experience it more, whereas the 5 as a withdrawing type, they're kind of holding their thinking internally, and the 7, we're going to get there, but the 7's kind of a clown, so you're over here managing your anxiety and your overthinking, but you're like putting on a happy face about that, and so people don't often experience that unless they know you really well.
I would almost go as far as to say for the 7, it's like if the 5 has withdrawn and is putting it internally, the 6s are doing it out loud, and then the 7s are like turning the overthinking into action. There's not a lot of time spent not doing something. And so it's like you're overthinking, but you're playing it out as overacting.
Yep, we're going to get there.
So with sixes, this core struggle is with anxiety. The way that they try to manage their anxiety, right, is to essentially build networks and structures and scaffoldings and communities in order to help them feel a sense of safety or security. Like they are combating their anxiety with things outside of themselves. This is where we're like moving into the compliant stance.
Right.
Um,
And part of it is because they're that anchor type and they have that push-pull, they don't really have access to the thinking on their own behalf.
Yeah.
And so they don't necessarily trust their own thinking about something.
Exactly.
But so then they want to outsource that into that compliant stance to say, what do you think about this? They want good advice from good people, but then they don't fully trust that advice either. And so then they pull back to their internal metrics. And so they end up with this kind of back and forth because they can't decide whether they trust themselves more or they trust the other people more. And so as a result, sixes tend to lean into those communities because they are finding that safety with like a number of people all think the same thing.
Yeah.
So if you really want to see a six that's in distress, watch a six as one of their communities breaks down or there's like a deep betrayal. I think you see it sometimes in like churches or philanthropic things that sixes are cued into, and then something happens and they start to feel like, is this a good group? I've been lining up with this group. You see it in politics on one side or the other when somebody is doing something that is horrific, which happens on both sides, and all of a sudden they feel like, I've been lining up with this particular, set of people, and they were the good guys, and now I'm not sure if they are, and so that puts the six into turmoil because they've been compliant to the group, to the community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, maybe aside from like the politics part of it, but a lot of these like communal breakdowns or these like experiences that sixes are having, believe it or not, sixes are kind of the architects of those breakdowns.
Okay, say a little more about that.
Well, so what happens with the six is...
Do you just go on our podcast and say, it's all your fault, six? You're the reason. What are you saying?
I mean, to some extent,
don't leave, sixes.
Don't leave. Hang with me here. This is an important thing that like...
Okay, say a little more.
So let me just preface this by saying... I think that every single type creates their own worst nightmare.
That is true.
That's true across the board.
Dang it.
Right? And we're nobody gets out, nobody gets free lunch. We're all screwed. Sixes do it in this
and we're all wonderful. You're welcome.
Yeah, there we go. That's
Positive
why
outlook
I can release here. But sixes do it in this way that's often a lot more visible because it's like roping in their entire community, right? Because sixes don't have a lot of faith in their own inner authority. They outsource their being and their identity to their entire community. Yeah. So when something goes wrong and sixes have to reckon with something internally, it requires the entire community to reckon with that because their identity is not just internal, it's also external. But what happens is sixes they've put so much faith and trust in the community, right? Like it's really kind of like a blind faith sort of situation. And that stems from the fact that they can't trust themselves. They don't have self-trust. They don't have the capacity to experience and live into their own inner authority. And so because of that, they're outsourcing all of this to their community. But as they do that and they get farther and farther away from their own inner authority and they become more and more invested in the authority of others, they start to experience kind of a rubber band effect where it's like, because they don't trust themselves, they truly can't have any faith or trust in other people. Because if you don't trust yourself, then you don't have the capacity to deal with or manage what other people may do, right? So if you've put too much faith in other people and don't have enough in yourself, you're eventually going to have to be distrusting of other people. And what we're experiencing is the 6 push-pull, right? So sixes are going to draw you in until they see that something is wrong, and then they're going to push you away, or they're going to test you in order to see, oh, can I trust this, right? So it's like they can put a massive amount of faith into a person, a relationship, a job, a community, what have you. And then like after the like honeymoon period, they have to really, they get hyper critical because they're trying to protect their own interest, and they don't trust themselves to manage or to deal with what might happen if somebody acts in a way that sixes can't forecast or anticipate.
Yeah. Yes, that looking ahead to like what could go wrong here is very quintessential
So big.
to the 6. And I think when you are in a place where you're over-identifying with a group, the bigger that group is, the higher likelihood that someone's going to really do something terrible, right?
Yeah.
Because you're in a group full of human beings. We're all terrible in 9 ways. And so you're
Look at you telling everybody we're terrible. Good job.
And we're wonderful in 9 ways.
There you
anyway, so, but because of that, as soon as one person in the group feels like they've betrayed the cause or they've betrayed the person, now the whole group is suspect.
Yeah.
And so that's where 6s kind of move away from being cooperative and community driven and into being suspicious, and that like push away, because now they've already been burned by someone in this group. And so what ends up happening if you let that go too far is that the whole group stops being human individuals and they start being one hive mind entity. And so it's very dangerous then, because if one person screws up, then the whole thing starts to fall apart for the 6. But it's also, in that process, it's dehumanizing to the people who are in the group who don't all think the same, who haven't all acted the same.
Yeah.
And so some of the work for the 6 is to be in groups and still see people as individuals.
Yeah, and I think that's part of one of the struggles for the 6, because they're seeing everything and they're taking everything in from the head center, because and then because it's not available for personal use, 6s are not great with nuance, and until they've done a lot of work, because so much fear and anxiety lives inside themselves, and they don't have the enough capacity for self-trust that it has to be black and white. Like outside of the head center, 6s are definitely the most black and white thinking. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done in order to do that and to see that nuance. And I want to go I really want to make the point here that this happens for 6s not just in communities, but it can also happen, and we could get a little bit into subtype stuff here, but it could also happen very much with a job, a cause. It could happen with a romantic partner. It like this intensity of like pull, push, what have you. It doesn't just happen in communities. It definitely does happen in communities a lot. And even if you aren't necessarily a social 6, you likely have done this with a community, because that's how 6s roll, just kind of in general. But that may not be where you see it play out the most. It could be in your romantic partnerships. It could be like, oh, this person is so wonderful. I'm in love. We've been seeing each other for 2 weeks, or what have you, right? And then, 1 week later, it's like, oh, I can't speak to them anymore because X, Y, Z, right? There's, and this is actually leading us into the emotional realness for the 6s. And this is kind of how this is playing out, which you can see with the 4s and the 8s as well, right, to some extent. But we talked about the push-pull in the 4s, and this is really stemming from the emotional realness. 6s are relying heavily on their emotions without the like highly developed and personal access to their head center to like make sense of their emotions. So it's really like I'm giving myself wholly to this person, to this job, to this cause, to this community. And then it's, oh my God, no, I can't. And I think that really like describes, what have I done? Yeah, what have I done? It's too much. I've been too vulnerable. I've invested too much. I can't trust this person, this job, this cause, these people, this community, et cetera. And I have to bring it I have to roll everything back. And so there can be a lot of this like
Sure.
back and forth.
When we were getting ready for this podcast, I was trying to think which is the conflict resolution style for the 6, and it took me a minute because I think with the other ones, you can really see it. The 8 and the 4, it's like, yes, intensely emotional, yes. But with the 6, I think you have that compliance and you have that overthinking, and so it was like, how does that play out?
Yeah.
So like, what does emotional realness look like for like a head center compliant person?
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you see that playing out?
I think it has a lot to do with kind of the emotional intensity that they bring to what they do. If you've spent any time with a 6, especially if the 6 leans more towards their heart center than towards their body center, it's very emotionally exhausting. Right. And we're all exhausting for different reasons, right?
Sure.
Again, I'm really trying to like make sure that people know, like, we're not picking on any one type. If you watch the videos, like, we pick on everybody, like, we all suck in our own special way. And as Kim would say, we're all wonderful in our own special way. But there's really, there's so much emotional intensity. It's, you know what I think of it as? 6s, that is it a Dr. Seuss book? The Are You My Mother? That vibe
I read
and
that book
energy.
like 1,000 times. We still say, "You are not my mother. You are a scary snorch."
Yeah, right? And so, okay, so that is the emotional realness of the 6, right? So it's this like going around literally asking everyone, are you my mother? Are you my mother? Are you someone I can trust? Are you someone I can trust? You can't be trusted. You're a snorch. Like,
You are very scary.
right? And so I think that's where the emotional realness really comes in. And when the chips are down, 6s are actually really good at saying what other people don't want to hear. And like not in a shitty way, but like in a way that like no one else is willing to give voice to something. Like, 6s are very willing and almost too eager to point out the elephant in the room. Right? So the overthinking and the compliance actually leads them to be like, hey, we're not looking at this, and we need to look at this.
Right. And actually that is a gift in community.
Exactly.
Because everybody is experiencing the elephant in the room and they're being cautious and they're tiptoeing around it potentially. But the 6 is saying like, hey, we've done damage here.
And we need to look at it.
It needs to be addressed. And so I think also because the 6 they're so hyper focused on forecasting danger, when that danger happens, they were right.
Yeah.
You might be wrong about 12 other kinds of danger that don't materialize, but when that danger happens, the 6 was right. And it needs to be acknowledged and it needs to be repaired. The 6 is really not the kind of person that is likely to just brush that under the rug and give a second chance without some sort of repair and acknowledgement.
And that's the emotional realness. That is, you need to see my emotional experience and it needs to be accounted for in how we move forward.
Yes, because when we think about the conflict resolution styles, we are really talking about what does this person need in order for this conflict to be closed, know? And so for the emotional realness styles, they need for that emotional experience to be seen and acknowledged. But the 6 needs for it to be repaired in a really desperate way so that they can go into the next community more resolved.
Or even stay in the current community.
Yes, of course.
Right?
Yeah,
like and I think that's a big piece for 6s as well. It's like to stay in something.
And I think generally they do. Yeah. But if it isn't resolved, because I have known a lot of 6s in community, and 6s are very loyal. That's why a lot of teachers call them the loyalists. They know who their group is, and they are sold out. But when that betrayal, that damage has happened and it has not been resolved, they stay in, but they get more grumbly. And it can become something that erodes slowly at community because nobody has given them the time to honor the emotional experience that they had or that they've seen other people have.
Yeah. And 6 is a lot like 2s. Like when we talked about 2s, we talked about how there's a level of like 2s kind of make themselves like an integral part of a community. Like they become the glue that holds things together. And 6s do that in a different way, but they still do that. So when 6s start to experience that grumbling, it affects everyone because 6s are connected to everyone. And to really highlight, I think, what a lot of people miss about one of the gifts of 6s, this ability to like forecast, to see what's going to go wrong. 6s are sometimes seen as like the Debbie Downer, like they can really zero in on unfun things, and people are like, oh, well, you're always so negative, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
That's actually a huge gift in community. And if we're talking about beyond community and maybe even more like the corporate space, it's something that really needs to be listened to. And that's because of this thing called the law of 3. So the geometry of the Enneagram, right, the sacred geometry part, there are 3 different shapes that correspond to different laws. We're going to talk about the triangle, the points 3, 6, and 9. It responds to the law of 3. And essentially what this says is that there is a yes in every situation, right, which is represented by point 3, right, which you can kind of get that vibe, 3s in your life. Yeah. 3s are definitely like yes people. Then there is always a no, which is the 6.
Okay.
And like, if you know 6s, they are no people. And essentially everything can kind of boil down to yes and no, being like stuck in this polarity, bouncing back and forth between yes and no, and they're always kind of fighting each other. But what the Enneagram helps us to do is understand that there is a third option, which is the 9, which is transcend and include, which essentially like brings us to a different level of consciousness. It brings us to a new way of problem solving. It creates something new. But you can't get there without both the yes and the no. People want to take the yes and then jump right to the 9 point and be like, oh, I've solved the problem. But
right.
If you skip over the 6, you've missed everything. You have to have both. And so, putting this in like a corporate setting, if there's a team member who's a 6, who's like always bringing this kind of like quote unquote negative energy, they're actually bringing something that's really valuable and will help you refine whatever it is that you're doing. Because one of the reasons why we call the 6 the devil's advocate, right, is because they're like always kind of like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this negative thing? But there's this idea that like in order, I think it's about like sainthood, like basically both good and bad would have to agree in order for someone to be considered a saint. So there would be somebody called the devil's advocate who would advocate for the devil, and basically this advocate would have to agree that the person in question was actually good enough to be a saint, quote unquote. And so essentially like
I do not know this.
There's a whole thing.
Okay.
So essentially like if your plan passes muster with the 6, with the devil's advocate, then it's like rock solid, right?
Okay. All right.
Because nobody's going to be able to disagree with it. Nobody's going to be able to stop it because you've already addressed the issues that the 6 is bringing forward.
Yeah.
And so when 6s are in that space, not every 6 really moves into that space really strongly, but a lot of 6s do. And it's a really valuable thing to see and to acknowledge that and to like take into consideration their concerns. Not only will that like increase their trust with you and your trust with them, but they also often have very, very good and valid points that get dismissed because they're too, quote unquote, negative.
Yep. And I think it's important to know that the 6 in their places, they are very invested. And if they are bringing what they see as a potential problem to the surface, they're doing it out of care for the family, for the organization, for the relationship. They see where this could really hurt us. and they want us to see it ahead of time and get in front of it.
Yeah.
And they are ignored often to our detriment.
Yes.
Because we like what we're doing. We like our plans. We don't really want to look over there at that. It might not happen that way.
Yeah.
And like you could kind of think of it like the 6 in a corporate space often guarding liability.
Yeah.
So you might not need that safeguard 25 times, but that 26th time it's going to cost you millions, you know? And so the 6 is going like, this could potentially be a problem. And it's true that the 6 will see more problems than ever materialize. But this, you know, like the 6 is thinking like, do we have enough gas? You know, the 7, I will get in the car and not know I'm out of gas until like the light is blinking. But it's really helpful if I have a 6 going like, you know, you only have like 1/8 of a tank right now. We're going pretty far. Would you like to stop at a gas station? I should listen to them, you know, and that happens in families and in businesses. And when we give a little bit of space, and we at least think through the things that they're bringing up, then they are not the Debbie Downer. They are the guard. They're guarding their communities and their groups because they want everybody to be okay. And they don't just want themselves to be protected.
They want
everyone to be protected.
Yeah.
And so I think some of the work of the 6 is to know when it's more anxiety than likelihood, and where their role is and things like that. How to celebrate things that are really good.
Yeah, that's a hard sell for 6s.
but 6s who do that work, it's very good.
Yeah.
Because people need to experience the positive things too.
Yeah.
And they're not the things that the 6 is fixated on. They're not fixated on what could go right.
Yeah.
Right? They're trying to self-protect by figuring out ahead of time what could go wrong. And so the work sometimes is to bring in some of that positivity so that people will be more likely to listen when they really have a good message of like, wow, we're in danger here. Yeah. But they are serving the community with their forecasting.
Yeah. One of the things, if you have 6s in your life and you're, you know, working with them, one of my friends who's a 6 used to talk about, she was in a panel and shared this, that like sometimes in order to get out of her like circular thinking around whatever like terrible issue was at hand, she would just take it and she would run it all the way to the end. Like she would just run it into the ground, and essentially every terrible thing that she was afraid of or what have you, would always, if she ran it to its logical conclusion, as she called it, she would end up dead. Right?
Yep.
But there was something about that in like running the scenario all the way to its natural conclusion that actually allowed her a lot of freedom. That like once she got to like, oh, I'll just die. Okay. Like that was suddenly like less scary for some reason. Now that may not work for every 6, but I've always found that really fascinating because 6s can get really like keyed up in this circular thinking around the same thing, and encouraging them to like take it farther, even if it seems scarier, can actually help break that cycle and allow them to like, that's probably not going to happen, right?
It takes
like
a lot of mental energy
Yeah.
to avoid doing your habitual thing. So like if you're trying not to do that, how much energy are you spending trying not? Just do it and then be done with it and then you can move forward. It makes sense to me.
Yeah. Well, we're about out of time.
Yep.
Thank you all so much for watching. You can find out more about my work at consciousenneagram.com. There's a Patreon page if you want to support the podcast.
Yes, do it.
And you can find Kim's stuff at
KimberlyandCoach.com. We're at Kimberly and Coach on Instagram. We're on LinkedIn.
Yeah. Sweet. So good stuff there. Thank you all so much for watching. Drop a comment below if you're a 6. Let us know how we did. We want to hear from y'all. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Cheers.